Okay. Good morning. Everyone on Zoom, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. All righty. So today I wanted to just go over the elements of all of the changes that are happening for the month of December. As most of you know, there's always two changes every year. One happens in June, the other one happens in December. So all of the changes either they remove forms, they add, or they delete information from specific contracts. So today's conversation is going to go into some of the important updates that C.A.R. has, and we're gonna dive deep into the conversation. And again, for everyone that's on Zoom, if you want to charm in, please do so as well. Stefan, great to see you, my friend. Thank you for being on the call. Appreciate it. So let's go into it. So some of the components right now that we're seeing is all straight from the California Association of Realtors. If you go to your C.A.R. website, type in new forms, you'll be able to um, get all of the redlining documentations. And the way you do this is I'm going to show you how you navigate that is when you type in the California Association of Realtors. Okay, let me go here. That'll take you into the platform here. Let me reduce this real quick. You're going to log into your account, and that takes you to this platform where it says search message. Type key, just type in new forms for 2024. It'll take you to this window. And now you go where it says new forms and revisions. You click on that. It'll tell you all of the new forms and revisions. And then you go to December 2024 forms draft and quick summary. Okay. Click here. Now you can get the quick summary. And you're going to also download all of the redline forms. By clicking here, it'll populate the standard forms and you have the option to download them. Once you download them, you can bring them into your computer. And now you can go through all of the revisions that all of the forms were done for December. So let's go to like the BCO. Just double click. And this is what the redlining form looks like. Now I want to emphasize that all of them are subject to change. Okay. So all of the changes are scheduled to happen December 16th. But the cool thing is they give us ahead of time all of the redlining that may be potentially added to the form. Okay, 1 second. Let me go ahead and mute some people. Okay. And as an example, here's like the the buyer counter offer. So there's not really much changes to the buyer counter offer. Obviously, the date is going to be changed. Okay, December 2024. So you want to make sure that you have the latest agreements in place, the latest agreements in place. Okay. Now, if you see the buyer counter offer, the only thing they added is all of the redlining information. This counter offer is valid regardless of whether any previous offer or counter offers expire by its terms. And then the late acceptance. So this was added to the buyer counter offer. If the date of seller's signature in paragraph 4 is after the expiration specified in paragraph 2A, Seller's accept is only binding if the buyer agrees to the later acceptance by signing below before 5 p.m. on the third day after the date of this buyer counteroffer is signed in paragraph 4. And then it says buyer accepts and agrees to the terms of the buyer counteroffer. So what they added is, let's just say, for example, you submit an offer, right? And that offer is only good for 72 hours, right? 3 days after you submit the offer, that starts the timeline for this offer to be considered, right? Either through negotiations or waiting for the seller to provide us with either an acceptance or counters. What now with the new changes is, let's say that the seller doesn't respond within the time frame of the 72 hours. What this new form allows you is that you can still navigate and ultimately after the expiration, still be able to work the deal and see if you can still get this offer accepted. Okay, that's where this added information is added and where the buyer will confirm. Let's say that the seller says, oh my gosh, we apologize for the delay, but we want to continue with the negotiations after your offer has technically expired, then we can continue with this form. And it's also for the seller counter offer as well. This additional language is there as well for that purpose. Okay. Let me show you also the buyer representation agreement. All right, so the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, again, you want to make sure that you're using the latest update, which is December 2024. What they've added to the buyer representation agreement is all of the redlining information. So on section B1, property type, single family residential, or if check, SFR is excluded from this agreement. Okay. Broker created. So now they added the language broker created. G2, they added this language in here. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. Buyer broker obligation to represent buyer in a transaction is contingent upon a seller's agreement to pay the amount of compensation in paragraph 2E1. Okay. On continuous right of compensation for broker involved properties, they've added the timing of such payment is subject to terms of paragraph 4D. Okay. Not much significant changes to the buyer representation agreement. Okay. Now, when I go back to, let's say, the BRBC on the summary, what I like about the summary, folks, is that it gives you a little bit more of the description and brief understanding. So under the new buyer representation agreement, it says it's clarifying the language regarding the broker contingency if the buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay the buyer broker. Compensation and sellers will not pay, added the ability to shorten the cancellation time frame on an exclusive agreement less than 30 days. So if we go back to the buyer representation agreement, trying to see where the added the information of the exclusive. Okay, so on the previous agreement under section 2A, if you don't check it, it's considered a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement. If you check it, which is this little box here, it's valid only if checked in its initial in paragraph 15. Okay. But there was additional language there that said about, having an agreement when it was an exclusive, that either party, the agent or the buyer, can give each other a cancellation of agency, or they don't want to continue working with you, you would have to give each other at least a minimum of 30 days. So they've eliminated that section. Okay. We touched a little bit on the buyer counter offer, clarifying that the counter is valid even if the previous offer counters expired, adding a new paragraph that will be able to rectify the contract if the acceptance came after the offer. So as I stated earlier, you're back and forth, or you don't hear from the listing agent or the seller, then with these new languages on the form, it really gives you the initiative and incentive that the offer can still be considered after, even though it expires 72 hours. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a new form, the cancellation of agency confirmation. Okay, so this is a brand new form that was created, and the form says that the form has two uses for it. The first section may be used to cancel the agency relationship between the buyer and the buyer broker, and the contract has been accepted, such as when the seller will not pay and the broker has the right to step out of the transaction in the representation agreement. The second part of it is used to cancel the agency relationship and amend the purchase contract to reflect the proper agency relationship, such as when an agent moves to a new broker and the new and old broker and the principal agree to the transfer. So let me populate that form. It's under form CAC. So we'll go here to all of the new revised forms and we look for CAC. Here it is. Double click. Now it populates this form, okay? So it's important that you get familiar with all of these new documents so that way you know how to navigate the conversations. So let's take a quick look at what this one says. One second. Do you know if there are any removed a lot of the documents that are attached to the BRC? Kendra, that's a very good question. I don't think so. I think they still include the agency disclosures, the possible representation agreement. So all of those forms, I believe, will still be part of the advisories. All right, so the cancellation of agency confirmation, an amendment to the purchase agreement. Okay, so this is a new form. You're going to put in the subject address, the buyer's information, the seller's information. Cancellation of confirmation of real estate agency relationship applies whether or not paragraph 2 is checked. Okay. So buyer's brokerage firm, that's going to be if you represent the buyer, you're going to put in your brokerage and then the signature. Part 2 goes into the cancellation of confirmation of agency, again, for replacing, right? So if you're going to tie the relationship, because let's say that you submit an offer asking the seller to pay you compensation under SBPP form, right? That's asking for the seller to pay us the concession of commission, and the seller and the listing agent come back and say we're not gonna pay any concessions whatsoever. Okay. And now you're going back to the buyer, and the buyer now says, look, you know, I was under the impression that we were going to try to collect the commission from the seller, and the seller now says they're not going to pay. What do we do here, right? Well, you have a couple options. Option 1 is try to renegotiate and submit a new request, a new SBPP, right? Let's just say, for example, when you submitted the offer and you submitted, you know, the proof of funds, the pre-approval letter, and you're submitting the SBPP, and now that's part of, again, the negotiations in the counter. They decline. Does that mean it's game over? No. You can still try to see if you're willing to get something. Then maybe you can do another counter offer saying, look, we want to reduce the commission coming to the buyer from 2.5% to maybe 1%. And then submit it to the listing agent and see if they'll consider that instead. So it's not game over just because they decline, right? But it's all about communications as well, folks. And it's important for you to understand that there's documentation here to help you navigate it. Okay. Now, more so, when sitting and consulting with a buyer, right? Part of the process now, you have to have a written agreement with the buyer. This is why we created the buyer representation agreement, better known as the BRBC. So when you're sitting and consulting with the buyers, you're going through the initial process of what it takes to get the buyer to be able to buy a property, the negotiations, the due diligence period, the inspections, to get them to close, and ultimately home ownership where you're handing the keys to the buyer. Okay. It's a process. You're involved in that. And you should be paid for services rendered, right? So now moving forward, since all these changes have happened, you're now navigating the conversation with the buyer, which the buyer is responsible to pay you. But it's also an umbrella of protection because in the past, a lot of agents, unfortunately, would not use any representation agreement. They would just wing it, submit offers, hope for the best, and that the buyer would stick with the process and stick with you to get to the close. And for the majority of times, agents were successful in doing so. But it's those one percenters where the buyer ends up going with another agent, right? And you're kind of like, what happened? I just spent so much time, effort, and energy with this buyer, and now they went in a different direction. You know, how do I get compensation, right? Well, the compensation doesn't come from the agent. If you had a written agreement, the compensation comes from the buyers responsible to pay you. We're only offsetting that amount because we're requesting the seller to pay us. Now, remember, everything has changed since all of the new NAR settlement and how we do business, right? Before, we used to have it on the MLS where we can see compensation, and that was our guarantee there that if we submit an offer, our offer gets accepted, then we were already guaranteed that percentage. Well, the MLS has removed that. Now, compensations is a negotiation tool. Okay. But in essence, what happens is now standard practice, you have to have an agreement. Because if the listing agent is asking for a copy of your BRBC, they want to know that you have a written agreement with them. Any experienced listing agent is always, as part of their negotiations, is going to ask for a copy of your buyer representation agreement to make sure you have a legitimate agreement with them. Okay. So in essence, now we go back to the momentum of the conversation, right? And the buyer says, look, I know that you're asking 2.5%, but let's say that it's if it's a first-time home buyer, right? FHA, 3.5%, very minimum down payment, closing costs. They barely have enough to pay for all this stuff, right? On top of paying a commission. But if they want to work with you, right? And the agreement says they are responsible to pay you commission, how do you navigate that conversation, right? Well, the buyer representation agreement has language in there about being full transparent of the approach. Can they or can they not? Now, part of your process now moving forward, ladies and gentlemen, is very vital that you need to be asking these qualifying questions. Because if they do have the means, then you can incorporate that when they're talking to the lender. Because the lender is going to ask them all of the qualifying questions that they need to know if they even qualify, on top of running their credit, right? Income, tax returns, right? Any additional income, maybe from a spouse or a significant other or a partner. Maybe they have a retirement money that they're also pulling money. All of these variables are important to understand if they qualify for a specific loan amount, right? But you also want to encourage and speak with the lender to include that 2%, 2.5%, or 3% that you're asking. So that the buyer knows upfront, hey, that's a cost that I incur as part of the closing costs. Because in essence, that's what it really is. Okay. Because in the mindset of a lot of sellers is, why am I paying a buyer's agent compensations when they're not taking care of my best interest? The buyer's agent should be the one that they need to take care of. I shouldn't be taking care of the agent. It's the buyer should, right? And this is why all of this transpired. And this is the reason MLS is no longer including compensation on the MLS. And this is the reason we're anchoring these conversations for you to understand the importance of written agreements to protect you and to protect the integrity of the process. Okay. But then let's say that this doesn't go as planned, right? The seller, after receiving your second counter, reducing that compensation, right? Because here's the way you can navigate this, right? You go 2.5% to the listing agent, right? And they come back and say, no, you send another request for 1%, right? And let's say that the seller says, yeah, you know what? It's a clean offer. You know, we're closing on a time that I'm comfortable with. The price is good, the terms are good. And the commission was the only factor here that I was kind of hesitant to pay 2.5%. But you know, now that the buyer agent submitted another request at 1%, I'll consider that. And let's say that the seller does accept. That means that the buyer is now on the hook, right? On the hook to pay 1.5%, and you're still getting that 1% from the seller. So it's a win-win. The cool thing is you can now get commissions from both parties. Okay. So I want you to think outside the box, ladies and gentlemen, when you're navigating these conversations. And the importance and understanding is you're negotiating on your behalf, okay? Because you're the one that's putting the time, the effort, and the energy in helping the buyer get to the finish line. No difference than you representing a seller to get them to the finish line as well. But let's just say that it doesn't go that way, right? Neither party wants to pay you compensation, and that can happen. How do you navigate now that approach? Okay. Well, the essence is one of the forms that was created is for that purpose, right? Because let me ask you, are you willing to work for free? Hey, this is family you're representing, right? This is someone I've known for a very long time. I got to help them. But look at the bigger picture, folks. Because if this goes sideways, right? And now you're involved in a litigation and you didn't charge anything, and now we have to escalate it to our E&O insurance. There's a deductible that the agent is responsible to pay. And if you didn't make any money, now you got to pay out of pocket when you didn't even make any money. It just doesn't make any sense. Any sense. So then you have to make an executive decision is, what do we need to do? Well, here's some options. Option one is have the candid conversation with the buyer and say to the buyer, hey, listen, you know, unfortunately, we try to get the commission from the seller. Seller, after trying numerous attempts to try to get something, they still declined. Okay, just no difference than a request of repairs, right? All properties are sold in as is condition, meaning that the seller does not have to entertain anything that the buyer requests, not fix it, not repair it, or excuse me, not fix it or replace it, or credit, or even a price reduction. They can sell the property in its as is condition, even though the roof is about to collapse. As long as they disclose, they can sell the property as is. Well, it's a safety hazard, safety issue. I get it, but the seller doesn't have to fix it. That's the awesome part of real estate is you can sell the property in its as is condition. Now, this is why you navigate these conversations in hopes that you can get the seller to do something, right? And that something can be fix it, Mr. Seller, replace it, Mr. Seller, give me credit in lieu of the repairs, Mr. Seller, or do a price reduction so then I can take care of it once I'm the owner of the property. That's what we call the win-win. So now when it comes to agency agreements and compensation from a buyer's perspective and a buyer's agent's responsibility, now we have uncertainty if we're even going to collect compensation. So now the buyer agent has to make a decision. How do we navigate this, right? I already told you one, right? Had the conversation with the buyer and says, look, if you want to continue with this property, by all means, I cannot stop you from doing so. I cannot stop you from doing so. If you want it, I just need to pull myself out of this. And now you become what's called an unrepresented buyer. Okay. Meaning now you represent yourself. You're not going to have an agent involved to help you with the process. And with all of the changes now, ladies and gentlemen, that's perfectly fine. I can get a piece of paper, right, as a buyer and put my price, terms, and condition and submit it to the listing agent. Well, Simon, don't you have to have a real estate license? No, not as an unrepresented buyer. Now you have the ability to do so. Okay. I can just put it all in writing, give it to the listing agent. Here's my offer. Now, any savvy listing agent obviously is not going to take that and say, yeah, we'll accept it, right? Because there's a lot of loopholes and a lot of issues with a small written agreement, right? Because it doesn't protect the buyer, doesn't protect the seller, and especially doesn't protect the agents. This is why we created these C.A.R forms for those protections. So if an offer on a napkin comes your way, it's a legitimate offer. It is. Okay. Don't get fooled. You have to present that to the seller. That's what an unrepresented buyer is. Now, there's exposure to that because remember, there's no agent representing and protecting the buyer's best interest and on their behalf. So if they're willing to go through that motion, that's on them. I'm out. Okay. Option number two is that the buyer understands the severity and the importance of having a licensed professional helping them through the process. And the buyer tells you, saying, look, Simon, as much as I want this, I just don't feel comfortable doing this on my own. And we don't even know if the listing agent is willing to take on a non-represented client either, because that's another layer of more paperwork and more time. It doesn't create dual agency, folks, but what it does create is more time that the listing agent has to do to prepare. And if the listing agent does have on the agreement to be compensated additional compensation, then yeah, the listing agent can maneuver and can work the transaction, but also understand that the listing agent only represents the seller, not the buyer. This does not create dual agency. The only way this creates dual agency is if the buyer now signs an exclusive or a non-exclusive agreement with the listing agent. Okay. But then it goes back to the same concern and circumstances, right? You're the listing agent, right? And you're collecting 2.5% or 3%, but you don't have any additional revenue or income coming from a non-represented buyer, right? Would you want to take on that responsibility? I don't know. Most will probably say, well, I'm already collecting 3%, 2.5%. I'm okay with that amount. And if you're fine with it, then you can represent the seller and navigate the transaction with that buyer. Or the buyer can decide to step out and say, look, let's just go ahead and rescind this offer. Let's go find another property that the seller may consider giving you compensation. Okay. So the cancellation of confirmation of real estate agency relationship for replacing a broker or amendment purchase agreement. So it has a couple sections here, 2A, 2B, 2C. To replace a buyer brokerage firm, seller brokerage firm with a replacement broker firm, agency, buyer and seller acknowledge receipt of the attached disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship, C.A.R from AD. Paragraph 2B of the purchase agreement is deleted and replaced with the attached agency confirmation form. Buyer and seller acknowledge the terms of the PRBS, which applies for the replacement brokerage firm, real estate brokerage sections, and all of the information here, right? This is again, if you're stepping out of that and now having your clients work directly with another agent or another brokerage. That's where the cancellation of agency and confirmation of an amendment to the purchase agreement, right? Where you as an agent are stepping out of this and having the buyer now handle it themselves. Questions, thoughts, or concerns? Repeat. Doesn't want to sign what? The cancellation? So if they don't want to sign off the cancellation, yeah, I mean, ultimately, you have that executive decision. I just don't foresee why a buyer would not want to cancel because you have the right to also, right, back out of the deal. If I'm not going to get compensated for services in response to my duties, why would I stay in the transaction? So let's just say, theoretically speaking, the buyer doesn't want to sign. No, I don't want to sign. You're backing out. You're not going to continue moving forward. You're going to document it. You're going to send an email to the buyer so that way you have paper trail saying, hey, look, I'm out of this deal, due to the circumstances that there's no compensation being paid. There you go. Exactly. Exactly. All right. So cancellation. All right. We're going to skip a couple of these because these are not too important. Cancellation of buyer representation agreement. They form C.A.R added the ability to cancel buyer representation for certain properties only, specifically related to the right to cancel under the BRBC if the broker is exercising contingencies because seller will not pay the compensation, reformatting to bring all compensation terms together, and the parties canceling will opt for either a unilateral cancellation or mutual cancellation depending on the situation. So let's look at C.O.B.R form. And let's look at the sample draft of the cancellation of buyer representation agreement. Okay, remember everything that is in red is all of the new added language to these forms. Okay, so again, this is the cancellation of buyer representation agreement. Effective date of cancellation. They've added this, that the buyer representation agreement is for non-exclusive representation. The cancellation is effective upon immediately upon, and it gives you days after receipt. B goes into the buyer representation agreement is for exclusive representation. The cancellation is effective 30 days, or they give you also the option now to either go more or lower, where before it was only 30 days. Now they added this a specific language in here that now you can add more than 30, or you can do less than, even on an exclusive agreement. Then you have where it's mutual cancellation with both parties. And this is again how you navigate, this agreement if you're no longer going to be working with this specific buyer. Hey, you know what? We're cutting our ties together, but in order to do so, paper trail so that way you have documentation, they have documentation, because you may get a very sophisticated buyer that, hey, they don't want to be responsible to pay 2, 3 different agents, right? Because they failed to get a cancellation. And that can happen. So your buyers are going to say, look, I need proof of receipt that we have mutually canceled, right? Because now the buyer would not be obligated to pay another agent, right? Because let's just say, theoretically speaking, you have to back out of the transaction and they have to go in as a non-represented, or they're working with the listing agent directly, right? But then the agent is like, man, oh man, I'm going to try to collect some type of compensation, you know? Well, if you have this agreement in place, right, this protects the buyer. Say, no, we've signed a cancellation of this buyer representation agreement, and here's the proof. I'm not entitled to pay you any compensation. Okay. And even if the buyer now wants to pay additional compensation to a new buyer, there's no control over that, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. It's just a unforeseen circumstances that I guess at the time they didn't want to, but now, they want to with a different agent, and that could happen. Scope of cancellation. The cancellation notice applies to all parties that may be subject to the buyer representation agreement. The cancellation notice applies only for the following properties, okay? So let's just say that it's only specific property, so there's a lot of information here. The buyer representation agreement remains in effect for all properties covered by this agreement. If checked, this cancellation is provided because the seller of the property identified in paragraph 2C2 above has declined to pay all or broker compensation due from buyer, and buyer has represented the buyer's lack the ability to pay the broker under Form BRBC. Broker withdraws from representing buyer for the property identified in paragraph 2C2, see Form CAC form, which we discussed earlier. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into it, but here's the other compensation due to broker. Expenses incurred, buyer agrees to pay broker, for out-of-pocket expenses, similar to what we see on the listing agreement. Let's say you did put time, effort, and energy. You have the right to cancel the agreement with the buyer, or you can also say, look, as part of the process, I put a lot of time into it. I understand that you do not want to work with me, and that's fine, but at least cover some of my expenses, right? Then you're gonna automate all of the expenses that you incurred as part of the process of helping the buyer through this process, right? And that's part of the way that you can then officially cancel if the buyer is willing to pay you for out-of-pocket expenses. Now, everyone has their own opinion of what out-of-pocket expenses is. It has to be reasonable, folks, okay? You can't say, yeah, I'll let you off, out-of-pocket expenses is $10,000, okay? You got to be realistic on that approach. Broker to receive a referral. Okay, so broker will receive a referral from the other broker pursuant to a separate written agreement. Again, here's the other take on it, right? You're in the negotiations on this, right? And ultimately you have to step out, but the buyer still wants to, and the listing agent is willing to take on that buyer, right? As an unrepresented buyer. But because this was your client originally, you might work a deal with the listing agent and say, Jack, hey, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to navigate this. Obviously, the seller is not willing to pay compensation. The buyer doesn't have the means or doesn't want to. Therefore, I'm stepping out, but the buyer still wants the property. Are you willing to take on this responsibility? And if the answer is yes, are you willing to pay me a referral? Because I got you already willing and able buyer. Everything is subject to negotiations, folks, is what I'm trying to stress here, right? And in good faith, right? Put yourself in that position, right? You are now the listing agent. Yeah, what's to say? Yeah, you know what? It's a good buyer, good terms. The seller will consider, I'll definitely pay you a referral. So then you step out, you don't handle any of the paperwork, but you still get a referral fee from it. It's a win-win. You didn't get the full pop, but you got something, right?
It's an example of that reason.
I don't know. I haven't experienced that yet. I haven't seen any agents yet go through this trenches. I don't know if anyone on Zoom has gone through that, but I haven't seen no agents so far get involved in a referral based negotiations. But it has it here where you can add that as part of the terms. Do we have some questions here? Let me see. Jenny says, how should an all-cash buyer who does not want to pay the agent compensation is asking the seller to cover its proceeds? Is there a box that needs to be checked on the BRBC? So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, a very good question, Jenny. When it comes to cash buyers, right? Obviously, they have the means to pay you, most likely, right? And this is again your negotiations, right? This is your position to ultimately navigate this when it's a cash buyer, right? You got to run the numbers and see. And you'll know right off the bat, because if they push and says, I don't want to pay you compensation, do you really, really want to work with this buyer? Okay. Now it's a gamble, right? It's a 50-50 gamble, right? You can say to it, okay, I understand you don't want to pay, but for the sake of transparency, I have to put something on the buyer representation agreement. I'm going to request that the seller pay me. Okay. And if the seller pays me, great. Then that offsets and takes you off the hook. But you can also modify that as well, right? Because let's say that they're not willing to pay you 2.5%, but they're willing to pay you 1%, and you're okay taking 1%. You can still now modify the terms of the BRBC just on what reflects on what the seller's willing to pay. Now, here's the issue that I see quite often. Well, why would a buyer sign a buyer representation agreement that says that I'm on the hook to pay 2.5%? Then you put something in writing that says otherwise, that you're going to request that from the listing side in the seller. And if we don't get any compensation, then the buyer is not responsible to pay. We're just doing it for transparency purposes. Remember, everything that you do has to be in writing. Find that maneuver and a way to navigate this, because let's say on a cash buyer, look, I want a property, but I don't want to pay you. Isn't it always been traditional that a seller pays you? Yeah, it's always been traditional. But the reality, if you really, really, really look at the scope of things, the buyers have always paid the commission because we need the loan or the cash from the buyer to make this happen. You know, we're just getting it from the net proceeds, but we need the buyer's funds to do so. So that's kind of the thing. But going back to the, cash, it really just depends. But you want to put something in language there that says, if the seller is not willing to, then, I decide to back out, and you can go in a different direction as well. And then the rest is just buyer and broker, mutual cancellations, buyer broker, allowed cancellation. Okay, and that is the cancellation of that specific form. All right, commercial, I'm not going to touch on that. Seller's contingency removal, they added a checkbox to extend escrow when removing the finding of a replacement property contingency. In order to exercise the right, it would have to be agreed to on the SPRP form. All right, let's continue. All right, on the lease listing agreements, Form LL, they've added information related to a new security deposit requirements, referencing the SDDA and advising that the RPO take photographs of the condition, adding a paragraph informing the RPO that the tenant may request the RPO pay the tenant broker. Okay. Nothing significant. The MLSA form, multiple listing service addendum, they removed the paragraph relating to the advertising and seller's willingness to consider offers with concessions. This was moved directly into the listing agreement, so which is a good thing. And I'll share a copy of the listing agreement, but they removed it here and then just incorporated into the listing agreement. Modification of terms, buyer representation agreement. Modify the agreement to make it usable for tenant representation agreements, added a pre-printed option to amend the property type, location of the property to be found, and to the change the agreement to an exclusive agreement. Also, the same thing with the listing agreement on the modification of terms. Open house visitor non-agency disclosure added a paraphrase to the title to explain that this can only be used for individual private showings. Nothing here that I want to touch on. They also did some changes to the RIPA form. I'm not going to go into it, but here's the listing agreement. So they added the paragraph to authorize the broker publish, advertise. So let me go into the RLA form. So you can see the significant changes that happen. Okay, so one of the cool things that I like here, what they did was with the listing agreement. Again, I want to stress and emphasize that this is the revised December 2024 listing agreement. And just for full transparency, it's all subject to change. They may still take it or they may not include it on the form. So we'll find out December 16th. So section C1 talks about compensation to seller broker. They've added broker created compensation schedule. So most of you have been receiving or should have received um, addendums that we created personally in-house, right? With all of this chaos and changes, right? We've created a form that if the seller is willing to pay concessions to the buyer or the buyer's agent, then we created a supplement agreement. So that's what broker create form means, which I love because everyone was kind of in the like, we shouldn't be doing that in essence, and I want to be crystal clear, right? And this is again straight from the California Association's legal department that if we create a form, right, and you reach out to C.A.R Legal, and when they're having a conversation, any form that was not created by C.A.R, they will not consult on it. Okay. So then you got to revert it back to the office, talk to the team leader, talk to the broker, who can help you navigate any concerns you have with any specific forms that the office has created. Okay. All right. So section E, publication of seller's willingness to consider concession. So here it is. So section E on the listing agreement is the parameter because remember, it didn't have that before. It only had where it said, what the commission or compensation to the listing agent, right? Which is here, 2.5% or a flat fee, okay? Or if we created our own broker create form, then you would check here and then you would present the KW form that we created. And then it talks about the additional compensation to seller's broker if it's a unrepresented buyer and what that percentage is, or if we created our internal KW broker form, okay? But then they added this additional language here that says the following. If checked below, seller authorized broker to market that a seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. And two, no amount of the possible concessions will be stated in such marketing unless seller notifies broker in writing of the amount. And then if check in the MLS listed above, if permitted by the MLS, and any other marketing outside of the MLS. Okay. Now I want to stress and I want to emphasize because again, it's still kind of on the fence. You start seeing a lot of agents put information that the seller is willing to consider concessions, right? But I want to caution you that because it's still kind of fresh, kind of new, is if you can avoid any type of marketing for the time's sake, let the other people do that for us until all that is set in stone and settled, the dust is kind of settled down. Then we kind of know what best practice and how we can navigate those concessions, right? If you have a listing, just go through the elements as, please submit your request. You know, is the seller willing to pay concession? The answer is yes. On the MLS, there's a section that you can toggle that allows you to say yes, no, or leave it blank. Now, if you leave it blank, then it's a negotiating tool, right? It- you can leave it blank. You can say, yes, the seller is willing to consider concessions. And remember, concessions can be many things. It's not just concessions to the buyer's agent. Concessions can be closing costs. Concessions can be request of repairs, right? All of those are concessions that the seller is willing to provide to the opposed party, which is the buyer or the buyer's agent's compensation as well. So what I like is the added language in here that says that now for full transparency, right? Now you can have a conversation, Mr. Mrs. Seller, publication of seller's concessions, are you willing to do so? Right? Where before it didn't have that, it was just more of a conversation, but now it's in black and white. Well, in essence, it's in red lining now, but eventually this will be in black. Okay, any thoughts, questions, or concerns regarding this?
So it's not one that to put yes or no. Concession is that, I'm not sure.
Absolutely, so you can definitely leave it blank. You can say yes to it, you can say no to it, or you can leave it blank, but that's again the seller's discretion. Obviously, when I'm looking on the MLS, I'm identifying the properties that have yes, because then I know that the seller's already willingness to offer concessions. If I see blank, okay, then I know that either they had the conversation, they didn't have the consultation on concessions, or they are just asking, hey, just submit a request on your SBPP form, right? Which is the request for compensation. If I see no, does that mean no? The answer is, yeah, it means no. Can you try? Yeah, absolutely. I've seen many, many times where you're having conversation, it's a great offer. Maybe the property has been on the market for a very, very long time, and the listing agent forgot that it had no on there, but now the seller's desperate in selling the property that they're willing to give some concession. And even though it says no on there, you can still ask the listing agent and submit your request for compensation. And who knows, you may just be lucky where it says no. And I've seen it many, many times on the MLS. And when I ask the listing agent, they'll say, yeah, just throw us an offer with your consideration of compensation. Okay, so a no doesn't necessarily mean no. Does that make sense? Okay. Not much on the listing agreement other than that. And it just goes into the concessions, and I'll read what it says. Seller concessions is the following. Concessions are monetary payments that a seller agrees to contribute towards the buyer expenses and other costs a buyer is responsible for in the transaction. Concessions may include, but are not limited to, cost of escrow, title, lender fees, repairs, inspections, and buyer broker compensation. There's your answer, folks. Concessions means all of the above. Concessions may, specified on the MLS, must be allowed to be used for any permissible buyer expenses or costs and must not specify the concessions are to be used for broker compensation. So you can't say, hey, the concessions are for your commission. Can't do that. Okay. So if you're on the listing side of it, concessions means in general. Okay, don't put commission, don't put a percentage. Okay, don't do a hand sign like this, and that's like saying, hey, we're paying 2%. All of that you're going to get flagged. Okay, so just say, hey, submit your request. That's it. Because remember, it's a negotiating tool, folks. When you get the offer, you're now going to present the offer to the seller. You're going to sit with the seller and says, look, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we got 3 offers on the table. Okay, we got offer A, we have offer B and offer C. Okay, A, B, and C. This one's offering this. This is the terms. These are the conditions. This is the compensation they're requesting. B is price, terms, and condition and compensation. price terms and conditions, right, and compensation. The seller now says, well, Simon, what's your take here? Well, let's explore the options here. Would you like to accept any of the three? Would you like to counter any of the three? Would you like to um, uh, cancel one, right? Not negotiate with one, but maybe just two. Or do you want to decline all of them and not even entertain the offers, right? Those are all of the options that the seller has. Well, Simon, let's go ahead and counter all three and see who brings the best to the best, right? And part of that is, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The cool thing about it from a listing perspective is that now you can use concessions as a tool of negotiations. Meaning that, let's say that all three come in with their price terms and conditions, right? Right, all three, and all three are asking for 2.5%. And then now you're drafting the counter offer on offer A, offer B, offer C. Bring us your best and final. Bring us your best and final. Bring us your best and final. And then you say, contingencies to be reduced from 17 days to 12 days, right? Appraisal to be reduced from 17 days to 10 days, right? But then you say the commission part of it, right? Bring us your best concessions. Now, the mine is, what are you thinking when they're saying, bring us your best concessions? Not the reverse, folks, where you're going to go up on they're saying, are you willing to reduce your concession from 2.5% down to maybe 2%, 2.25%, 1.5%? Because now, remember, the less concessions given, the more net the seller makes. So you got to use kind of reverse engineering on that. Does that make sense? So that can be, and I've seen counters that way where it does show, bring your best, concessions to it. Yes. Uh-huh.
Accepting the seller 1%, for instance, the commission. Okay, now, let's say it was a 2.5, 1.5 is gonna pay the buyer. Do we go and change the RBC, we edit it, and we make it something that is gonna pay 1.5%?
Say the question again, I'm sorry.
That's EBB to the seller,
Mm-hmm.
and he says I'll pay 1% only. I will deal with him, the buyer, let's say it was 2%. He has to pay us 2%. Just to the other side, 2%. Or automatically will pay.
No, you have to put it in writing
Again.
on the counter offer. Okay. So remember, a counter is sent out to you, right? A seller counter offer says, give us your highest and best, right? These are the terms that we're asking for, right? You're going to receive that, and now you're going to present that to the buyer. And you're going to go through the channels of those line items, right? Saying, okay, they're asking us to give us our best and final. And that best and final can be, look, I'm maxed out. I already submitted my best offer. I don't want to go any higher. Okay. But on the terms, let's say the contingencies, right? The contingencies from 17 days to 12 days, I'm okay with that. We'll go ahead and accept those. But the concession aspect of it, right? Let's just say that an agent is also, because, agents will be agents, sellers will be sellers, right? And now if they're very knowledgeable on how concessions work, that's now part of the negotiations. I hate to say this, okay? And I want to practice, good, um, you know, good practice with the other agents, because I like to play fair game with everyone, right? My mindset is always going to still consistently try to fight for the buyer's agents, because the buyer's agents work their tails off and they deserve to be compensated for work, and it really just, I don't like it, but the reality, I have no control. None of us have control of what transpired. If we can leave it the way it was before, where commissions were still on the MLS, but the reality, that's not the case now. So in essence, if that's something that you need to put in writing on the buyer counter offer, and you can be firm and stern and say, look, no, my worth is 2.5%. I'm not going to reduce my commissions on it. And you can do that. Okay. just because they throw it at you doesn't necessarily mean you have to go down on that. You may be able to go others, but you can be firm on your concessions, on your SBBP.
Understand how to, but say if he is accepting to pay 1%, seller. To pay 1%, deal with him. Other one,
No. No, so the question here is if you're asking for 2.5%, the seller's willing to pay 1, but the buyer's still on the hook to pay 1.5, you get the offer accepted. How is that gonna work? Well, you're gonna let escrow know. Because escrow is gonna need a copy of the receipt of your buyer representation agreement. And the buyer representation agreement is gonna say 2.5%. Well, the counters are gonna say that the seller agreed to 1%, right? So now the math is simple. The seller pays 1, the buyer representation agreement says that the buyer will pay you 1.5. So when they're drafting the paperwork, the escrow instructions are gonna say seller 1, buyer 1.5%. So when the deal is ready to fund and buyer brings in the necessary funds to close, they're gonna say you got to bring in your closing costs, your down payment, minus your deposit, and if the 1.5%, let's say, is 15,000, then we're going to incorporate that as part of the money to bring in. Correct. Simple math. Yeah. All right. I think Kendra, you had a question. Let me see here. So I understand that the concessions can be negotiated, but be careful about divulging or our colleagues in our own worth. 100%. Yeah. Again, for me, concessions are like putting them in a safe, right? We need to protect our commissions, right? But it's between all parties, right? We're asking the seller to pay concessions, right? But we're also asking that the listing agent really pitch and fight and defend us as well, right? Because we're influencing the sellers too on the importance and how to navigate. And part of that is, look, we need to take care of the buyer's agent too, right? Because again, pros and cons, we're going to look at all of the information. We're going to look at the proof of funds, and if we can see that the buyer has the means, right? Let's say they're buying a property for 500,000, but they have in their bank account $1 million, right? The buyer should take responsibility too, and take care of the agent they chose to work with. Okay. Hey, Christine, Simon, can you repeat the person's question? We cannot hear. I hope I was able to answer that for you already.
Yes, you did. Thank you. We can't hear anybody in the audience when they're asking a question. We can't hear it.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Okay, so that kind of concludes this offer. Let me just go quickly through the last parts of the summary, and then we'll cut loose. So open listing, nothing. The RPA, so on the RPA, the modification part was the 3G to provide more clarity related to the seller payment to cover buyer's expenses. Paragraph 3G3 now includes the amount being requested for payment to buyer broker. Buyer is making an affirmative representation that they have a valid agreement and that covers the property, and the compensation is at or above the amount requested, and the buyer will not be required to provide the proof of the compensation agreement on the SPBB is being removed. Reformatted and added clarification. So let me look at this form real quick. RPA, so RPA. Section G3, here it is, folks. So G3 was an added language in here. Seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker, buyer's compensation affirmation. If checked, seller agrees to pay out of the transaction and proceeds a percentage of the final purchase price and, if any, flat fee towards the obligation of buyer's compensation. Buyers affirmatively represents that at the time this offer is made, buyer has a written agreement by buyer broker, and that it's valid, covers the covers the property and provides the compensation for no less than the amount stated above. Okay, so this is good to know. So if they're gonna eliminate the SPB form, right? Which is a good thing. I just didn't understand why we had to have a separate form when we could have incorporated already in the purchase agreement. So that's one less document that we have to add to it. Now, when you check this, now it automatically says here, this is what we're asking for compensation. Okay. Whereas before, you check the SPB and it would populate the form, and then that's where you would put in the percentage. Now they just incorporate it. They're going to eliminate the SPB form, and now you're going to ask for your compensation here. Okay. All right. With that being said, I want to respect everyone's time. We're not going to continue with it. There was just minor other changes. Any final questions, thoughts, or concerns about today's session? All right, cool. Awesome. Stefan, I'm surprised you didn't have any questions for me, my friend.
Yeah, it's all good stuff, Simon. I appreciate it. You know, the one thought I did have is that we're going to have to educate the agent on the other side of the deal often. So I'm just excited to see so many of our agents getting educated so that when we go to the marketplace, we can be the leaders and have more knowledge than the guy next to us.
That's right. I appreciate always your feedback, Stefan. True leader, my friend. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to your team leaders, your brokers. We're here to help and serve. And thank you. Be safe. And we'll see you on the next contracts class. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Simon.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
All
Simon.
right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.